My sister stood in the center of the living room, smiling like she owned the air in it. The house was loud that night. Glasses clinked. People laughed. And the smell of roasted turkey drifted in from the kitchen. It was an early Thanksgiving gathering at my parents' home in Bethesda, Maryland, and nearly every relative we had seemed to be packed into the living room. Melissa loved nights like this. She had one hand resting proudly on her husband's shoulder, while she spoke to a circle of relatives who were hanging on every word. "You all know Jason basically runs the firm now," she said, laughing lightly, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Several people looked impressed. My aunt leaned forward. "The whole law firm?" Melissa nodded confidently. "Well, maybe not officially. But they depend on him for everything." Someone joked that we should all be careful what we said around such an important lawyer. Everyone laughed. I stood quietly near the dining table with a glass of iced tea, listening to the familiar rhythm of the conversation. Melissa gestured briefly in my direction. "Oh, and Danielle works somewhere in legal too," she added casually, like it was a minor footnote. No one asked more questions. They turned their attention right back to Jason. I had just started to take a sip of my drink when the front door opened. A tall man stepped inside. He scanned the room once. Then his eyes landed on me. He stopped walking. For a moment he simply stared, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Then he said my name. "Wait, Danielle, you're here." And just like that, the entire room fell silent. Earlier that evening, everything had felt perfectly normal. I arrived just after sunset, the sky outside already turning dark as I pulled into my parents' driveway. Their house glowed with warm yellow light, and I could already hear voices through the open windows. Inside, the living room was full of relatives I hadn't seen in months. My mother was moving between the kitchen and dining room, carrying trays of food while greeting guests. Football played quietly on the television in the corner, mostly ignored. Melissa, of course, had taken control of the room almost immediately. She was 4 years older than me and had always been the kind of person who naturally attracted attention. Loud laughter, confident stories, big gestures with her hands when she spoke. Family gatherings often felt like a stage she knew how to perform on. I was the opposite. "My name is Danielle Harper. I'm 32 years old, and I work as an attorney in Washington, D.C. More specifically, I work at a large corporate law firm downtown." But that night, like most family gatherings, I didn't say much about it. I greeted my parents, hugged a few cousins, and found a quiet spot near the dining table where I could watch the room without becoming the center of it. Melissa and her husband Jason stood near the middle of the living room. Jason was a lawyer too. He worked at the same firm I did, though in a different department. Over the past few years, he had slowly become the family's unofficial legal expert. Whenever anyone had questions about contracts, business paperwork, or anything remotely legal, they asked Jason. Melissa encouraged that image. She loved describing his work in dramatic ways. That night, it started when my cousin Ben asked Jason how stressful it was to work at such a big law firm. Jason began explaining something about long hours and complicated clients. Melissa interrupted him halfway through. "Oh, please," she said, laughing. "You're making it sound boring." She wrapped an arm around his shoulder and looked around the room proudly. "You all know Jason basically runs the firm now." A few relatives laughed. My uncle raised his eyebrows. "Runs the firm?" "Well," Melissa said quickly, smiling even wider. "Maybe not officially, but they rely on him for everything." The story grew more impressive every time she told it. Someone asked Jason if he handled major corporate deals. Melissa answered before he could. "Of course he does." People nodded, clearly impressed. Then my cousin noticed me standing nearby. "Danielle," he said, "don't you work in law too?" I opened my mouth to answer, but Melissa spoke first. "Oh, Danielle works somewhere in legal as well," she said lightly. "Nothing like Jason's department, though." The conversation moved on before I could respond. I was used to that. Melissa had always been better at shaping the story in a room. I usually let her. A few minutes later, As she continued explaining how demanding Jason's job was, the doorbell rang. My father excused himself and walked to the front hallway. Most of the room barely noticed. Melissa was still talking. "My husband practically runs the entire firm," she said again. Then the front door opened. A tall man stepped inside wearing a dark overcoat. My father greeted him warmly. But the moment the man looked up and saw me standing near the dining table, his expression changed. Recognition spread across his face instantly. He walked a few steps forward, still staring. "Danielle," he said, clearly surprised. "Wait, Danielle Harper? You're here." And suddenly 20 people in the room turned to look at me. For a moment, no one said anything after the man spoke my name. Every head in the room turned toward me, then toward him, then back to me again. I could feel the weight of their curiosity before anyone even asked the question that was hanging in the air. How did that man know me? But to explain that moment, I have to go back a little earlier in the evening. Because the truth is, what happened in that living room didn't start when Robert Whittaker walked through the door. It started years before that, with the quiet way my family had always seen my sister and me. Melissa had always been the one people noticed first. Growing up, she had a voice that filled every room. She laughed loudly, told dramatic stories, and somehow always knew how to turn a simple moment into something memorable. At family gatherings, she moved easily from group to group, hugging relatives, asking questions, making everyone feel like they were part of the conversation. People loved that about her. And in many ways, she deserved the attention. She worked hard, built a successful life, and carried herself with the kind of confidence most people admired. But somewhere along the way, a simple idea quietly settled into the family's mind. Melissa was the successful one. I was the quiet one. It wasn't that anyone said it directly. It was just the way conversations unfolded. I remember a moment from years ago that made the pattern clear. When I was 19, our family gathered in the same house to celebrate the end of the school year. That night, I had just received a major academic scholarship for law school. I had spent months working toward it, studying late nights, filling out applications, preparing for interviews. When I told my parents, they were proud. But later that evening, during dinner with relatives, the conversation shifted toward Melissa. She had just started a marketing internship with a small company downtown. My aunt asked about it, and suddenly everyone was listening to Melissa describe her new office and her coworkers. My parents smiled proudly as she talked. By the time dessert arrived, no one had mentioned the scholarship again. I didn't resent Melissa for it. That was simply how our family worked. Melissa's life was easy to talk about. Mine was quieter. Years later, when we were both adults, that same pattern followed us into our careers. Melissa married Jason Caldwell. Jason was a lawyer working at a prestigious law firm in Washington, the kind of place relatives recognized immediately when they heard the name. Whenever family members had legal questions, Jason became the person they asked. He didn't seem to mind the attention. Melissa certainly didn't. Over time, the story grew larger every time she told it. First, she said Jason handled important clients. Then she said he was trusted by the partners. Eventually, she began joking that he practically ran the firm. And because Melissa said it with such confidence, people believed it. Meanwhile, I worked at the exact same law firm, but I never talked about it much. When relatives asked what I did, I usually gave a simple answer. I work in corporate litigation. That phrase meant almost nothing to most people outside the legal world. Melissa often stepped in to translate. "Oh, Danielle helps with legal cases," she would say casually. Then she would turn the conversation back toward Jason. At first, I corrected her once or twice, but it quickly became clear that arguing about careers during family dinners only made things uncomfortable. So eventually I stopped. It was easier that way. That night at the Thanksgiving gathering started exactly the same way every other family gathering had for years. Melissa moved easily through the room, greeting relatives and introducing Jason to anyone who hadn't met him yet. Jason shook hands, smiled politely, and answered questions about the legal world. People were fascinated by the idea of someone working at such a powerful law firm in Washington. I arrived quietly, said hello to my parents, and found a place near the dining table. From there, I watched the familiar story begin to unfold again. At one point, my cousin Ben asked Jason what it was like to work at such a big law firm. Jason started explaining the long hours and difficult cases. But Melissa interrupted him halfway through with a laugh. "You're making it sound boring," she said. She placed a proud hand on his shoulder and looked around the room. "You all know Jason basically runs the firm now." A few people laughed. Someone asked if that meant he controlled all the big decisions. Melissa smiled wider. "Well," she said dramatically, "they definitely rely on him." People nodded with admiration. Then someone noticed me standing nearby. "Danielle," my cousin asked, "don't you work in law too?" Before I could answer, Melissa spoke. "Oh, Danielle works somewhere in legal as well," she said lightly. The room nodded politely. Then the attention returned to Jason. Melissa leaned closer to him, clearly enjoying the moment. "My husband runs the whole firm," she repeated. That was the exact moment the doorbell rang. Robert Whitaker walked straight toward me. At first, most people in the room didn't recognize him. To them, he was simply another guest who had arrived late to the gathering. My father was still near the hallway greeting him warmly, explaining where to leave his coat and offering him a drink. But I knew exactly who he was the moment I saw him. Robert Whitaker was the senior managing partner at the law firm where Jason and I both worked. He wasn't just another attorney. He was one of the people who decided the direction of the entire firm. I had seen him in meetings, in conference rooms filled with senior partners and major corporate clients. People listened carefully when he spoke. Associates rarely interacted with him directly unless they were working on something extremely important. And now he was walking across my parents' living room toward me while my entire family watched. "Danielle Harper," he said again, his voice carrying clear recognition. I set my glass down on the table beside me. "Yes," I said. A small smile appeared on his face. "I thought that was you." By now, the conversations in the room had completely stopped. Every relative who had been laughing moments earlier was now quietly watching the interaction unfold. Melissa stood frozen beside Jason, her expression caught somewhere between curiosity and confusion. Robert stepped closer and shook my hand. "What a surprise," he said. "I didn't expect to see you here." "My parents live here," I replied. "This is a family gathering." "Of course," he said, glancing around the room as if realizing the situation he had just walked into. Behind him, I saw Jason stepping forward. Jason extended his hand politely. "Jason Caldwell," he said. "I also work at the firm." Robert nodded and shook his hand. "Nice to meet you." The exchange was polite, but noticeably brief. Jason seemed slightly puzzled. Melissa, however, quickly stepped in. She moved closer with a bright smile, clearly trying to regain control of the moment. "Oh, Jason works at the firm too," she said enthusiastically. "He handles some of the biggest cases there." Robert listened politely. Melissa continued, her voice carrying that same confident tone she had used earlier. "My husband basically runs the firm now." A few relatives chuckled nervously, unsure how to react. Robert tilted his head slightly. For a brief moment, I thought I saw the faintest hint of amusement in his eyes. But instead of responding to Melissa's claim, he turned back toward me. "How long have you been in town?" he asked. "I arrived earlier today," I said. "Good," he replied. "You deserve a break after the last few weeks." That sentence landed softly but heavily in the room. Jason's expression shifted. Melissa blinked. Several relatives exchanged quick glances. I realized immediately what Robert was referring to. 3 months earlier, I had been leading a complicated corporate case involving one of the firm's largest clients. The situation had nearly turned into a full legal crisis before we managed to resolve it. It had required long nights, endless meetings, and careful negotiation. Apparently, Robert had not forgotten. Jason looked between us. "What case?" he asked. Robert answered casually. "The Harrison regulatory matter." Jason frowned slightly. He clearly recognized the name of the client. But his confusion deepened. That case involved multiple departments, Jason said slowly. Yes, Robert replied. Then he looked at me again. Danielle led the legal strategy. The room grew even quieter. Someone behind me shifted in their seat. Melissa let out a small laugh. Oh, Danielle helps with research sometimes, she said quickly. Robert looked genuinely puzzled. No, he said calmly. She directed the case. That sentence seemed to freeze the air in the room. Jason stared at me. You led it, he asked. I nodded slightly. It was a team effort. Robert smiled faintly. You're being modest, he said. The firm was relying heavily on your judgment. Several relatives were now openly staring at me. My aunt whispered something to my cousin. Across the room, someone slowly set their glass down on the coffee table. Melissa's confident posture had started to fade. Just 15 minutes earlier, she had been proudly telling everyone that Jason practically ran the firm. Now, the senior managing partner of that same firm was standing in my parents' living room, describing my work instead. Robert continued speaking as if nothing unusual was happening. That case was extremely complex, he said. The client was facing serious exposure. Jason remained silent. Robert added one more sentence. And Danielle handled it exceptionally well. The words hung quietly in the room. I could feel the entire story Melissa had built that evening beginning to crack. And I hadn't said a single thing. Earlier that evening, before Robert Whittaker ever stepped through the front door, the living room had felt like a stage. Melissa stood right in the middle of it. She loved hosting moments like that, even when it wasn't technically her house. She moved through the room like she owned the energy of it, greeting relatives, laughing loudly, drawing people closer with every story she told. Jason stood beside her with a polite smile, occasionally answering questions about his work. But Melissa was the one truly running the conversation. A few cousins and a couple of our aunts had gathered around them. Curious about life inside a big Washington law firm, Jason had just started explaining how demanding the job could be. Some weeks you barely sleep, he said, shaking his head slightly. Corporate clients can be intense. Melissa laughed. You're making it sound boring, she said, gently nudging his arm. She turned toward the group like someone about to reveal an exciting secret. You all know Jason basically runs the firm now. The group reacted instantly. My aunt's eyebrows lifted. Runs the firm? Melissa shrugged modestly, though her smile made it clear she enjoyed the attention. Well, maybe not officially, she said. But they depend on him for everything. Jason gave a small, slightly awkward laugh but didn't contradict her. Someone asked what kind of cases he handled. Jason began answering, explaining how corporate clients often needed legal guidance for contracts and regulatory issues. Melissa interrupted again. He's being humble, she said proudly. They trust him with the biggest decisions. The admiration around the circle grew. My uncle nodded approvingly. That's impressive, he said. Not many people get that kind of responsibility. Melissa beamed, standing near the dining table. I watched the conversation unfold the way it always did. Melissa built the story. Jason allowed it to grow. The room believed it. Eventually, my cousin Ben noticed me. Danielle, he said, turning slightly. Don't you work in law too? For a brief moment, the attention shifted. I opened my mouth to answer, but Melissa stepped in before I could speak. Oh, Danielle works somewhere in legal too, she said lightly, waving her hand in my direction. The tone was friendly, almost affectionate, but dismissive. Nothing like Jason's department, though, she added. A few people nodded politely. Then they turned right back to Jason. I felt the familiar sensation of fading quietly out of the center of the conversation. Melissa wrapped an arm around Jason's shoulder again. You all should hear about the case he handled last month, she said. Jason looked slightly embarrassed, but didn't stop her. It was one of the firm's biggest clients. Melissa continued. Jason tried to interrupt. It wasn't just me, but Melissa laughed and talked right over him. He's too modest, she said. The firm practically depends on him. Someone asked if that meant he would become a partner soon. Melissa's eyes lit up. Oh, they already rely on him like one. Jason smiled nervously. I leaned against the table, listening. The strange thing was that Melissa didn't seem like she was lying. She genuinely believed the story she was telling. Confidence had a way of making exaggeration feel like truth. The group around her grew larger. More relatives drifted over, drawn by the conversation. Jason answered questions about corporate clients and lawsuits. Melissa translated his answers into something bigger each time. At one point, she laughed and said it again, louder than before. My husband practically runs the entire law firm. Several people laughed. One uncle joked that we should all behave carefully around such a powerful attorney. Melissa laughed with them, clearly enjoying the moment. I glanced toward the kitchen where my mother was arranging plates for dinner. Then the doorbell rang. My father excused himself from the group and walked down the hallway toward the front door. The conversation in the living room continued. Melissa was halfway through another story about Jason's work. He's always dealing with the biggest corporate clients, she was saying. I heard the front door open. A cold gust of evening air drifted briefly into the house. Footsteps followed. I didn't look up immediately. I was still watching Melissa's performance in the center of the room. Then I noticed the sudden shift in my father's voice as he greeted the guest. Robert, he said warmly. Glad you could make it. That name made my attention snap toward the doorway. A tall man stepped inside, removing a dark overcoat. He shook my father's hand and stepped into the living room. For a moment, he simply scanned the room. Most people barely noticed him yet. Melissa was still speaking. My husband runs the whole firm, she said again. Then the man's eyes moved slowly across the guests, and suddenly they stopped on me. The change in his expression was immediate. Recognition. He took a step forward and began walking directly toward me. Robert Whitaker walked across the living room with calm, steady steps. The conversations around him faded one by one as people noticed where he was going. At first, the room didn't understand what was happening. They simply saw a tall man in a dark suit crossing the floor with the quiet confidence of someone used to being listened to. But I knew exactly who he was, and I had the strange feeling that something was about to change. My father followed him part of the way, still speaking warmly. Everyone, this is Robert Whitaker, he said to a few relatives nearby. We went to college together. Several people nodded politely. To them, Robert was simply one of my father's friends who had arrived late to dinner. Melissa barely looked at him. She was still standing beside Jason in the center of the room, finishing another sentence about his importance at the law firm. He's constantly dealing with the biggest clients, she said proudly. A few people laughed, but Robert's attention had already moved past them. He was looking directly at me. For a second, his expression was thoughtful, like someone trying to place a familiar face in an unexpected setting. Then recognition spread across his face. He stopped walking. Danielle Harper, he said. The way he said my full name carried a tone that instantly drew attention. Every conversation in the room paused. My aunt turned around. Jason looked from Robert to me. Melissa blinked. I nodded slowly. Yes. Robert's expression shifted into a smile. Well, that's unexpected, he said. He stepped closer and extended his hand. What are the chances of running into you here? I shook his hand. My parents live here, I said. This is their house. Ah, he said, glancing around the room. That explains it. By now, the entire living room had gone quiet. Relatives were openly staring at us. Jason stepped forward, clearing his throat slightly. Jason Caldwell, he said, offering his hand. I work at the firm as well. Robert shook his hand politely. Nice to meet you. The exchange lasted only a second. Jason seemed to expect something more, some sign of recognition. Maybe. But Robert's attention drifted back toward me almost immediately. Melissa noticed it too. Her smile tightened. Oh, Jason works there too, she said brightly. He handles some very important cases. Robert nodded politely. Melissa leaned closer to Jason and repeated the line she had been proudly telling everyone all evening. My husband basically runs the firm. A few relatives laughed again, though the laughter felt thinner now. Robert's eyebrows lifted slightly. Instead of responding, he turned toward me. "How long have you been visiting your family?" he asked. "I arrived earlier today," I said. "Well, I'm glad to see you taking a break," he replied. Jason frowned slightly. "A break from what?" he asked. Robert answered without hesitation. "The Harrison regulatory case." Jason's eyes narrowed in confusion. "That was a complicated matter," he said slowly. Robert nodded. "Yes, it was." Then he looked at me again. "Danielle handled it exceptionally well." The words seemed to echo in the quiet room. Melissa gave a short laugh. "Oh, Danielle helps with research sometimes," she said quickly, waving her hand as if correcting a misunderstanding. Robert looked genuinely puzzled. "No," he said calmly. "She led the legal strategy." The room fell completely silent. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Jason stared at me. "You led that case?" he asked. I nodded slightly. "It was a team effort." Robert smiled faintly. "You're being modest," he said. "The firm relied heavily on your judgment." My uncle shifted in his seat. Someone behind me whispered something under their breath. Melissa looked from Robert to me as if she had suddenly stepped into a different conversation entirely. Robert continued speaking, completely unaware of the tension spreading through the room. "That client situation could have turned into a major legal disaster," he said. "Danielle kept it under control." Jason's expression had changed. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked confused. Because he knew that client. Everyone in the firm did. But apparently he hadn't known who had been directing the case. Robert added one more sentence. "The partners were extremely impressed." I could feel the room watching me now. Just minutes earlier, everyone had been listening to Melissa explain how Jason practically ran the firm. Now, the senior managing partner of that same firm was standing in my parents' living room praising my work. Melissa's confident smile had completely disappeared. And for the first time that evening, she looked uncertain. No one spoke for several seconds after Robert said that. The room felt strangely smaller, as if the walls had quietly moved closer. Conversations that had filled the house only minutes earlier had completely disappeared. Every pair of eyes seemed to be moving between me and Jason. Robert, however, looked perfectly relaxed. He stood with his hands loosely at his sides, as if this was simply a casual conversation between colleagues and not a moment that had just overturned the entire story Melissa had been telling all evening. "That situation could have gone very badly," he continued calmly. "The client was facing significant regulatory exposure." My uncle frowned slightly, clearly not understanding the legal terms, but recognizing that whatever Robert was describing sounded serious. Robert nodded toward me again. "Danielle managed it extremely well." Jason shifted his weight. "You said she led the strategy?" he asked. "Yes," Robert replied. Jason looked at me, trying to reconcile the information with the picture he had always carried in his head. "Across departments?" he asked slowly. Robert smiled faintly. "Yes. It required coordination between several teams." A quiet murmur passed through the room. Relatives who had been sitting back casually were now leaning forward slightly. Melissa forced a small laugh. "Well, Danielle has always been very hardworking," she said. Her tone sounded different now, less confident, almost cautious. Robert nodded politely. "That's true," he said. Then he added something that shifted the room even further. "The firm has been relying on her quite a bit recently." That sentence seemed to land heavier than the others. I heard someone set a glass down on the coffee table. Jason's expression tightened, because he understood something the rest of the room didn't yet fully grasp. At a firm like ours, people the leadership relied on weren't junior attorneys. They were people with authority. Melissa folded her arms. "So Danielle works on some projects," she said carefully. Robert tilted his head slightly. "Some of the most complex ones," he replied. The silence deepened again. Across the room, my cousin whispered something to his wife. My aunt stared openly at me. Jason rubbed the back of his neck, thinking, "How long has she been doing that?" he asked. Robert glanced at me. "A few years now," he said. Jason blinked. A few years. He clearly hadn't expected that answer. Because if I had been leading major corporate matters for years, it meant something obvious. Something he had somehow never noticed. Melissa looked at me as if she were studying a stranger. You never mentioned any of this, she said. Her voice carried a quiet accusation. I met her gaze. I was never asked, I said simply. The words hung there. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably. Robert seemed to realize the tension he had walked into. He gave a small, polite smile. Well, he said lightly, I didn't mean to turn this into a work discussion. But the moment had already happened. The truth had already entered the room. Jason looked at me again. His voice was quieter now. I didn't know you were leading those cases. That's normal, I said. Different departments. He nodded slowly, but I could see the realization forming in his mind, because he understood the structure of the firm, and he knew exactly what kind of responsibility Robert was describing. Melissa looked around the room. The attention she had controlled earlier that evening had completely shifted. No one was asking Jason questions anymore. Instead, people were watching me. My uncle finally broke the silence. So, what exactly do you do at the firm? He asked. I answered calmly. I handle corporate litigation and regulatory disputes. It sounded simple when I said it like that, but the way the room reacted made it clear that the meaning had changed. A few relatives nodded slowly. Jason looked down at the floor for a moment, then back at me. You've been doing that for years, he asked. Yes. Robert checked his watch. I should greet your parents before I leave, he said politely. He nodded toward me once more. Good seeing you, Danielle. Then he walked toward the kitchen. The moment he stepped away, the room remained quiet. But the silence felt different now, because everyone in that living room had just realized the same thing. The story Melissa had told all evening was not the real one. And for the first time, Jason was looking at me like he understood it too. For a few seconds after Robert walked away, no one moved. It was as if the entire living room needed time to catch up with what had just happened. The same people who had been laughing around Melissa only minutes earlier now stood quietly, their attention drifting toward me. Someone cleared their throat. My cousin Ben spoke first. So, you handle major corporate cases? He asked carefully. His voice sounded respectful in a way it hadn't earlier. Yes, I said. How long have you been doing that? A while, I replied. Ben nodded slowly, clearly trying to process the information. Across the room, my aunt leaned forward slightly. That sounds very complicated, she said. You must work with big companies. Sometimes, I said. I kept my answers simple. I had never been comfortable talking about work like it was a performance, and tonight didn't change that. Still, I could feel the shift in the room. Earlier, I had been the quiet sister standing near the table. Now people were looking at me like they were trying to understand who I actually was. Jason was still standing a few feet away. He looked thoughtful, almost unsettled. I honestly didn't know you were leading cases like that, he said. I shrugged slightly. Different departments, I said. He nodded. That's true. Large law firms often worked that way. Teams could spend months on major matters without everyone knowing exactly who was running them. But the truth was clear enough now. Melissa stepped forward. Her expression was tight. The confident smile she had worn all evening completely gone. You could have told us, she said. The words were sharp, but there was something uncertain beneath them. I looked at her. I never hid anything, I said. Melissa crossed her arms. You never said anything either. That's not the same thing. The room had grown quiet again. Relatives were pretending to sip their drinks or glance toward the kitchen, but everyone was still listening. When people asked what I did, I continued calmly. I answered. Melissa shook her head. You made it sound small. I described my job. Jason glanced between us. You did say you worked in corporate litigation, he admitted. Melissa looked frustrated. Well, I thought that meant... She stopped herself. The sentence didn't need finishing. She had assumed. Everyone had, for years. I leaned lightly against the dining table. Most of the time, I just didn't feel like explaining everything. I said, family gatherings had never felt like the right place to break down the structure of a corporate law firm. Melissa exhaled slowly. So you just let people think Jason was the big lawyer in the family. Jason winced slightly at that phrasing. I didn't let anything happen, I said. I just didn't correct it. There was a difference. One of my uncles spoke up from the couch. Well, he said, glancing between Jason and me. Sounds like we misunderstood things. A few people laughed quietly. Not mocking, just awkward. Melissa didn't laugh. She was still studying me like she was trying to reassemble a puzzle she thought she had already solved. You could have told me, she said more quietly. I considered that. I could have, I said. And you could have asked. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Jason broke the tension. I guess I owe you a congratulations, he said. His tone was sincere. For that case, Robert mentioned, thank you. He nodded once. I remember hearing about it internally, he said. I just didn't know you were the one leading it. I smiled faintly. Now you do. Around us, the room slowly began to relax again. Someone in the kitchen called that dinner was almost ready. A few relatives started moving toward the dining room. Conversations restarted in low voices. But the atmosphere had changed. Melissa looked around the room. Earlier, she had been the center of it. Now people were glancing at me with curiosity and a kind of quiet respect. She seemed to notice that too. Her shoulders lowered slightly. Well, she said after a moment, forcing a small smile. Looks like our family has 2 successful lawyers after all. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to one she had ever offered. I nodded. That sounds about right. Jason chuckled softly. And for the first time that evening, the tension in the room began to fade. The house slowly returned to its normal rhythm after that moment. Conversations began again, though quieter than before. People moved toward the dining room as my mother called everyone to the table. Plates clinked. Chairs scraped softly across the floor, and the smell of warm food filled the house again. But something in the room had shifted. I could feel it in the way people looked at me. Earlier that evening, I had stood near the edge of the living room while everyone listened to Melissa talk about Jason's success at the law firm. Now relatives approached me with a different kind of curiosity. My cousin Ben came over first while people were gathering their plates. So how long have you been working on those corporate cases? He asked. Several years, I said. He shook his head slowly. That must be intense. It can be, I replied. Another relative joined the conversation. What kind of companies do you usually represent? Mostly large corporations dealing with regulatory issues or lawsuits. They nodded with interest. The questions kept coming. But the tone wasn't intrusive. It was simply curiosity, the kind that comes when people realize they may have misunderstood someone for a long time. Across the room, I noticed Jason speaking quietly with my uncle. Every now and then he glanced in my direction. His expression looked thoughtful rather than defensive. Melissa, on the other hand, had grown noticeably quieter. She still moved through the room greeting relatives and helping my mother bring dishes to the table. But the confident energy she carried earlier had softened. Dinner eventually began. Everyone settled into their chairs, passing plates and serving food while conversation slowly returned to safer topics. Sports, holiday plans, travel. But every so often someone would turn to me and ask another question about my work. I answered simply each time. There was no need to impress anyone. The truth had already done that on its own. At one point, the front door opened again. Robert Whitaker stepped into the dining room briefly, coat over his arm. I'm going to head out, he said politely. My father stood up immediately. Leaving already. I have an early morning meeting, Robert replied with a smile. He shook my father's hand and thanked my mother for the invitation. Then his eyes found me again across the table. Danielle, he said. I stood and walked over. Good seeing you, he said quietly. You too. You handled that Harrison matter extremely well, he added. The partners noticed. Thank you. He nodded once. We'll be talking about some important projects soon. I expect you'll be involved?" It wasn't a formal announcement, but anyone who understood the firm would know what it meant. Then he gave a polite wave to the rest of the room and stepped outside into the cool evening air. The door closed behind him. For a moment the dining room felt still again. Then my aunt leaned toward me slightly. "Well," she said with a smile, "we're very proud of you." I thanked her quietly and sat back down. Dinner continued. The conversation moved easily now, but I could feel the difference in the room. Jason spoke to me normally, even asking a few questions about one of the corporate clients I had worked with. Melissa stayed quiet for most of the meal. Later, while people were clearing dishes in the kitchen, she approached me. Her voice was softer than usual. "You could have told me," she said again. I looked at her. I didn't think it mattered. She leaned against the counter, thinking, I guess I made assumptions. Everyone did. She nodded slowly. For the first time that evening, she didn't argue. Instead, she gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Well," she said, "I suppose the family learned something tonight." So did I. Later that night, I stepped outside onto the front porch for a moment of quiet. The air was cool and still. Inside the house, I could hear my family laughing again, the sound drifting through the open windows. For most of my life, I had allowed Melissa to dominate the story at family gatherings. Not because I felt smaller than her, but because correcting people often felt unnecessary. Tonight showed me something I hadn't fully understood before. Silence can sometimes protect peace, but it can also allow the wrong story to grow. The truth, when it finally appears, has a way of changing everything. And sometimes the strongest response isn't arguing or proving anything. Sometimes it's simply letting the truth reveal itself. That night I walked back into the house and joined my family again. But something inside me felt different. Not louder, not more confident, just clearer. I no longer felt the need to shrink myself to keep the room comfortable. The story people believed about me had finally caught up with reality. And strangely, I had barely said a word. If you've ever had a moment like that, when someone underestimated you, or when the truth about your work or your worth finally revealed itself, I'd really like to hear your story. You can share it in the comments. And if you enjoy real stories about family drama, quiet revenge, and those moments when the tables finally turn, stay with the channel and subscribe. There are many more stories like this still to come.